Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Ryan Bivens, representative of the 24th District, which includes Greene, Hart, and LaRue County. Going to come to you today and talk to you about eminent domain. I've got a couple of guests here with me. I'm going to let them speak and tell their story first, and then we'll kind of summarize at the end. So turn it over to Ms. Rebecca Steele.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Steele, and I'm here to speak on behalf of my community, Bourbon County and beyond, and my family. I'm from a long line of farmers, actually founding farmers in California. I've spent half my life here in Kentucky. Eminent domain took land from my family in California, my great-grandparents actually. And there were times that my mother and grandparents had to live very frugally in the years when the crops were down. When the crops are up, that land is more valuable than the amount of money that's given for eminent domain. It's the future value of the land they're not compensated for, future income. It was not enough. My grandparents passed away when my mom was in her late 20s, and she had to sell more land due to inheritance taxes, and then we came here to Kentucky. And it was hard to find the property we wanted. We had to invest quite a bit in infrastructure, covered arenas, fencing, quite a bit. Could not find the property exactly how we needed it for the purposes of cattle and horses. My mother was put over $400,000 into the dam of her lake a couple years ago. She was looking at future income of maybe doing a wedding venue when we caught wind of the threat of eminent domain. She completely stopped spending because any improvements, we were not going to receive the value of that. Anybody who has sold farmland, I'm a real estate broker. People are surprised often that they're tobacco barns and such. The value is not in the building, it's in the value it brings for income. So our whole community, there was houses that had just gone on the market. They sat. Everybody was frozen. Your choices in life became, frozen. We needed more transparency as to what was going on. We needed to know if we were going to be compensated, that it was going to be fair and enough, because you can't just pick up your farm and move to the same thing. It's not that easy. My mom is 72 years old, and her whole life she has worked to keep this land that's been worked so hard on by my family and pass it on to the next generation. That's what she does. And we've invested quite a bit of money in I'm just going to give you some examples of dollar amounts recently in the last 2 years. It was $415,000 for the repair in the dam for our pond. Almost $300,000 in roofs the last 2 years, barns, shelters for horses, and the housing. And the last 2 years, we had to pause the fencing during the eminent domain threat, and that paused $440,000 that's in the last 2 years been completed. The fencing company has had work to do for the last 2 years. This doesn't include all of our expenses, of course, and employees and so on. So I'm asking that we please make eminent domain a last choice. It obviously affects future income. I didn't even get into the sentimental value of our land. My neighbors are farmers, and they're at the retirement age, and their life plan has been to work on that farm until they die. That's what their parents before them did on the same property. It's devastating. The idea of you're retiring and your land's going to be taken. What are you going to do? You're not going to move to the city if you're a farmer. It's a way of life. That's it. I appreciate you all hearing my story.
Thank you all for having me. My name is Ike Van Meter. I'm from Lexington, Kentucky. My family has a cattle farm in Bourbon County that we've had since the 50s. And then my dad, who passed away about 6 years ago, added on to it and doubled the size of it about 25 years ago when the land was for sale. He bought it at the asking price because he thought it was a good investment, and we've looked after it ever since. So a little history. In 2017, we got a call from a neighbor asking us to look into whether some rumors were true about, the condemnation or eminent domaining of around 2,500 acres for a proposed 10,000 foot runway in Bourbon County. And that was the first any of us had heard of this. So I don't know how long discussions had been held, behind closed doors. I don't know what parties were involved. Since then, we have collected information and found things out. But during that time, and up until today, I still don't know, and we've still never really gotten to the bottom of who the end benefactors would have been. We're always told it's secret. We were sworn to sign non-disclosure statements and so on and so forth. So, out of town, corporate, commercial clients are being part of the process, but the constituents, the landowners, and the people most affected are not part of any process. We learn about it when the first article is written in the paper with everybody else. Yet we own the assets that are wanted by private companies, and they're going to use the state in turn to get those assets for a certain price. Once the community found out about it, there was obviously a lot of uproar, and we held some get-togethers for the people that would be most directly affected by the project. And then once the local government in Bourbon County kind of saw the writing on the wall, it was turned away, and the judge executive, stopped it in its tracks, and we continued to go on about our lives. I would hear rumblings that things were happening, discussions were still being held in Frankfurt between parties. And then in 2023, we see it in a line item in the budget. Again, nobody has ever to this day ever approached me about buying my land for any dollar amount. Nobody with any power has ever spoken to me or any other landowner in that area. We don't have any information on, again, who these private, it was going to be a P3 partnership. We have no idea who the private partners were, right? We don't know who the end benefactor is of these projects. Yet we're taking land from citizens of this state, citizens of that county, and landowners of that county, taxpayers. It is my belief that this should be a more open process, that should be open to the affected parties from the beginning. I think there should be requirements to strengthen and determine the real party of interest in these projects, whether it's a true public need or whether the end benefactor is a private company, because replacing private for private is not capitalism. Capitalism, you offer me something, I either reject it or take it. This is setting a price to make a project that is pretty much not viable, right? If they have to pay what I want for the land, it may not be a viable project. And another aspect of it is that me as a private landowner, I have agriculturally zoned land. When the government is used in eminent domain, that land can be rezoned without going through the proper channels that I would have to go through to rezone my land industrial. So theoretically, overnight, once this is rezoned industrial, that asset is worth more than it's grown for us in 80 years, right? Just by using that power. And that power is benefiting a private entity, not a public entity. And we need to make certain that the burden of proof is on whatever agency is using eminent domain, that there is not a better place to do it, and that all avenues have been exhausted, and that we get top dollar for our land. If the end use is industrial, you buy my ag land as industrial prices. And then I guess it is supported by the Kentucky Farm Bureau as of now. I kind of got lost there. I apologize. and to piggyback on what Rebecca said, we get lost too, and we make it all dollars, and this idea that, we've taken time out of our schedules and our businesses have suffered because we are very hesitant to reinvest in these businesses if they are that fragile and can be taken that easy from us. It is very, very hard to put in dollars to something that may or may not be taken. And for it to have happened twice within 6 years shows me a true lack of care of this issue, because the community said no once. It just simply went from the local government to the state government, and the same thing occurred with little to no information again. To this day, the second one happened in 2023. To this day, without our own digging, we asked, we're not given any information. We still don't know what the true want was. We've heard things all over the board: military, private, DHL, a million things, but nobody's, I'm not going to say, it's just, we've never been told, and nobody is coming out and saying, hey, let's have the conversation. So that's where we are today. We feel like there needs to be changes, and this is the start. Thank you all.
I want to start off by sharing these two stories. These are personal people that have been personally affected by eminent domain. And I'll be the first to say, I think all of our role in government is to help, not hinder. Oftentimes we think about economic development. We think about building new roads. We think about utilities. Those of us in agriculture, we enjoy every bit of that. I enjoy having nice roads. I enjoy having clean water, and I enjoy having lights in my house. And I enjoyed going in last night and having cold air conditioning in the house. We enjoy utilities. Sometimes it's not just a big project that gets affected. It's a small project. I had a personal dealing with my father-in-law's farm where the state took a piece of road or a piece of land to build a road, straighten a road. The sad part is, as a business person, as a farmer myself, for those of you who don't know, I'm a full-time farmer. But as a farmer and a businessman, before I use an asset most of the time, I have to pay for it. Over the process, this ground was taken from my father-in-law. Construction started. The road was built before a price was ever agreed upon what was going to be paid. Now, that's wrong, folks. You treat people the way you want to be treated. Eminent domain is a tool in the toolbox, and granted, it's probably one that we need to leave in the toolbox. But it's like many other things. I'm sure all of us can sit here and think around the room of a bill that has passed, and then all of a sudden, let's blame an agency. They get it and they interpret it. And guess what? That's not the bill we passed. That's not the way it was meant to be interpreted. Sometimes things get pushed, that gray area gets a little further. So last year I introduced House Bill 630, and I didn't bring that up today and have it in your docket because I wanted to put it out there for discussion. A couple things I think that wanted to do is, first of all, let's look at fair market value. Oftentimes when a piece of land sells, you might have somebody there as a farmer wanting to buy it to farm the ground, a developer wanting to put in a residential, industrial, or commercial development, or maybe you have some other use comes out. That is a fair system, an auction system. It's not right for somebody to go in through eminent domain and say, well, we're going to give you this for a piece of ground because that is what that ground was being used for. It's no different. Let's take all of you have some type of retirement system. Let's go in and saying, well, you did this, so we're only going to pay you this much for it. In a lot of cases in agriculture, most farmers, their land is their retirement. They pour everything into it. The big difference is, and we can talk about other things being taken, a house or something like that. The problem is you can go build a new house. Lots of times you can't find a piece of ground that is similar to what that farm is. And oftentimes when you look at it, when roads are built in, there's adverse effects that comes to the rest of the ground that is left there if they take a part of it from that land. Another big thing that my bill addressed last year that I think is sad, and sitting with a group at the Judiciary Committee, I think you all have all seen this and experienced this before, is a lot of times when someone sues you, you have the opportunity, if the court rules in your system, you can ask for damages. You can ask for your legal fees back. You make an investment. That's not allowed when it comes to eminent domain cases. There was a farmer in southern Kentucky who fought an eminent domain case. They was wanting to take a piece of his farm to put in a road, whatever it may be. He fought it in court, wound up winning. Amassed over $250,000 in legal fees. That was out of his pocket. There was no recourse for him to go back on that because of how the law was stated. So that's one other thing our bill addressed. It gave us an opportunity to go back because sometimes things aren't right and sometimes they do not win in the court system, and it's a shame for that landowner to be out those costs with no way to come back on it. Anybody that's in business has been wrongful, had someone threaten lawsuit against them before, and it's a shame when you cannot go back on that. You know, I think we talk about oftentimes, and I think all of you can appreciate this in our jobs, we need to remove emotion from it. We need to remove emotion when we make decisions. But it's pretty challenging sometimes for those of us in agriculture to do that. And we get real sensitive when you start talking about eminent domain and taking my ground. I laugh. Most people, if they followed me through a rural countryside, they would think I'd been stopped off the local joint and had a few brewskis or something beforehand, Representative Nemus, because I might be swerving on the road. But oftentimes it's because I'm enjoying the views of a piece of crop ground or pasture field, because that's what I do, and that's where my love and appreciation's at. You know, it's hard to remove that emotion because you do get emotionally attached. Because I can't tell you the number of nights this spring, and I can sit here and tell you this has been the spring from hell for a farmer. You think the rains have affected you, you ought to be trying to put a crop out this spring. But the number of nights that I've gone in that my kids, my wife have been in bed, and the number of mornings, the next morning I leave out and they're still in bed. And it's not because they're sleeping long hours, it's because I'm not sleeping much at all. Because when the weather's right, you have to make it go. And the only reason we do that is because we have a love for the land. You know, we talk about dirt. When most people drive up and down that road and they're swerving, they look across there and they see an open field and they see dirt and they think about what's the potential they could make off of that. But it's not dirt. Dirt's what we get on our clothes. That's soil. In Kentucky, we're blessed with some of the finest soils with a very great growing environment. And we have to protect agriculture. I've said it before, I think down the road that our children and grandchildren one day are going to wake up in this country and they're going to wonder where our food supply is going to come from. You know, this is not going to solve all the answers, but I think this is the first step in doing so, and we've got to be able to protect those. We got to respect that. We talk about economic development oftentimes, and we talk about what we need to create jobs. You know, as a farmer, I've got 9 full-time employees that couldn't go to town and make the amount of money they make working for me right now. So I'm a job creator. You know, I'm running a multi-million-dollar business that turns over in that rural economy. That it's known that rural dollars, ag dollars, turn over 8 to 9 times in a rural community. We have to protect that, and we've got to start looking at agriculture not as that open piece of ground of what we can do to put blacktop or concrete over it. We got to think about what it does for the economy. And it's not just about looking at that piece of ground. You know, last year when I introduced this, I raised some awareness, I think, with some utility companies. And I wanted this for discussion. It's not attacking anybody out there. It's about bringing them to the table. You know, when I go out and dig a ditch across my farm, first thing I have to do is call 811. And oftentimes, everybody else has to do that. But one thing they don't do, and I'm never notified of it, but I can't tell you the number of times that I've had a utility pole set through drainage tile systems, that oftentimes it's what we put under the ground. We go in and put this stuff in, and we got to think about this. We got to start stop looking at agriculture as what we can do, how we can better that ground and understand what it means for our ground. We've just experienced some of the worst flooding this year in our state ever. And I've told people, a lot of times you got to think about the amount of concrete, blacktop, roof lines that we put up. That's less water that's infiltrating in the ground. It's running off. You know, so it's also about environmental. But I think this is just one step, and I wanted to start the conversation today. And I appreciate Mr. Chairman, the committee, I appreciate your all's time, and I would be happy to open for questions for now. Turn it over to Representative Roberts if he has comments.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to expand beyond the scope of agriculture and to say I concur with these individuals is an understatement. Eminent domain has been vastly abused, not only in Kentucky, but throughout the United States, and farmers, poor, and minority communities are usually the ones who take the brunt of that. It's been more than 20 years since Kelo versus City of New London was decided. For those who are unfamiliar with this case, Suzette Kelo worked her entire life to get a little pink house in the City of New London in Connecticut. The city initiated eminent domain proceedings not for a road, not for a community center, not for any government use, but to transfer ownership to a private multi-billion-dollar corporation. Ms. Kelo, represented by the Institute for Justice, took this all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and unfortunately in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court incorrectly held that it is constitutional for the government to take one's private property to transfer to another private entity. Since then, we've seen several states, Kentucky included, enact reforms in order to try to add protections. Some of the best states that have done it, Florida and Virginia, they truly represent the property owners. But here in Kentucky, our efforts, unfortunately, did not go far enough. We still have requirements that allow individuals to have their property taken to be given to other private entities. We have instances of the burden being shifted to the property owner to prove the eminent domain is improper, where it's the government trying to take their property. It should be on us as the state to prove that what we are doing is truly necessary. And it's continuing to happen to this day. So the protections we enacted in 2006 were not enough. I can think about a 300-acre farm that was used for an industrial air park. I can think about a convalescent home that provided housing for 25 disabled adults that was demolished for a parking lot. I can think of just last year where a widow of over 50 years in the same home has lost her home to a road expansion. She lost everything. She's facing eviction proceedings right now, and we have failed to offer adequate protections to property owners like Janet Arnett. And it's happening now in Boone County once again. On July 30th, the Transportation Cabinet has a meeting about an eminent domain project that would take the property of 14 families, including the families and current Korean War veterans, just for a sidewalk expansion. This is not the proper role of government. And the reality is these homes, they're small. They were starter homes by the standards of the 1950s. We take these people's homes, there's not just going to be an economic cost to them, where 86% of those who are subject to eminent domain wind up paying higher housing costs than they paid before. In fact, the median rent for their new homes in current eminent domain proceedings is almost double what they currently pay. So this simply has not been an adequate protection. But there's a human consequence. These individuals are the backbone of Boone County. Our farmers, our veterans are the backbone of Kentucky. And the reality is 75% of people who are subject to eminent domain of their residents, within 5 years after eminent domain, they still have not made a single friend in their new community. So there was a legislation filed last year, House Bill 353. This is the Institute for Justice's model legislation to protect property owners. It does just a few things, but it all exists on one fundamental cornerstone, and it is that property rights and consent are fundamental to a moral and just society. House Bill 353, which I think meshes extraordinarily well with Representative Bivens' legislation on compensation, also adds procedural protections. First, it does what we should have done more than 20 years ago, and it bans the use of eminent domain to take property from one person to give it to another private entity. The Fifth Amendment says that it must be for a public use, not for a private use. It also further ensures that local governments, when using eminent domain to secure correction of blight, must give notice to the property owner and must give them adequate opportunity to cure. I'm not against ensuring that property is kept up to an adequate standard of safety and habitability. But what we have to do is ensure that eminent domain is truly a last resort as is intended under our current statutory scheme. It also requires local governments, as we currently do at the state level, to hold public hearings and give advance notice to property owners to ensure that they have an adequate opportunity to have their voice heard. It also further requires, in order for an inspection for blight, that the government must go to the court and get an administrative warrant. They can utilize other means of like exterior deterioration and other adequate pieces of evidence to establish probable cause, but they must get a warrant to enter. But finally, and in my view most importantly, it requires that the burden of proof is on the government before someone's property can be taken. Now, this is just a starting piece as well, but I think that we can absolutely all work together to ensure property owners are protected, the public interest is protected, and that when something along these lines is necessary, that adequate compensation does happen. In fact, in Florida, property owners have the right to negotiate the payment. I think that's a fundamental that we should consider, given that if I were to sell my home to another private entity, I would have that ability. But here in Kentucky, property owners are at a fundamental disadvantage when they're facing losing their homes. And with that, I open to questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.